everyone, and welcome. My name is Marguerite Ward, and I'm a senior reporter at Insider, writing for this section called Better Capitalism. Today, we're talking about the corporate fight against climate change. Here with me to talk about everything from how to avoid corporate greenwashing to the ESG movement is Professor Klaus Schwab, founder and executive chairman of the World Economic Forum and author of the book Stakeholder Capitalism. Klaus, thank you so much for joining me.
Great pleasure to be with you, Margaret.
There's more and more recognition that a viable economy not only relies on treating people well, but treating the climate well, as you describe in your book. Do you think CEOs have fully adopted this mindset that treating the climate well is good for shareholders?
Certainly, those executives who have a longer-term thinking have clearly adopted this mindset. And if you look at the reasons, they are very obvious. So it's first an economic reason. I think what we have learned from the coronavirus is that prevention, the cost for prevention is much lesser compared to the cost of removing afterwards the damage. So we have a situation where you have a kind of free ride because you don't have to integrate all your external costs into your business model, but someone will have to pay for it. Or we will be in a situation like tobacco companies where down the road you will have class action, and already today investors recognize this danger, this risk. There are investors who hesitate to provide capital to companies who really are damaging the environment.
So you really believe that investors are recognizing the risk?
I said investors who are thinking long term. Of course, if you want to make a fast buck, it's a different matter.
Right.
But at the end, I think companies will recognize that they will be better off, even economically, if they take care of the nature, because young people, at least my employees, don't want to work anymore for a company or for an organization which is damaging the nature. And I think clients, customers do not want to buy products of such a company. So I think it's in the direct commercial business interest of companies to take care of the planet.
Absolutely. In your book, you write, ultimately, it's actions rather than words that make the difference in becoming a stakeholder company. When I think of accountability in climate change, I think of ESG metrics, environmental, social, and governance criteria. Here in the US, the SEC just created an ESG task force to promote the disclosure and transparency of ESG criteria. And a report by Proxy Review shows that over 300 ESG proxies are headed to vote this spring. How do you feel about the surge in attention to ESG reporting?
I think it's a great evolution. Some people would even say a revolution. But we should not forget that the ESG metrics, so measuring ESG responsibility, is only part of a total integrated system. It starts with defining your strategies, where you have to take into account the present and maybe even future expectations of your stakeholders. So it's strategy formulation, it's the responsibility of the board, it is, of course, execution, not only inside the company itself, but throughout the whole supply network. And at the end, you have the measurement system, the ESG metrics. So we should not look at the ESG metrics just as some kind of a formal, let's say, additional reporting system. I think to do the ESG performance in the right way, you have to look at it as an ecosystem which integrates the company as a whole.
So ESG is part of the system.
ESG is the tail end, if I may say so, but it starts by the integration of environmental, social, good governance criteria into your strategic process.
Now, there are those who are still against certain ESG metrics. For example, billionaire investor Warren Buffett recently urged shareholders to reject proposals for more transparency of climate-related risks and diversity and inclusion efforts. What would you say to Buffett and others who reject more transparency?
I would like to have a discussion with him. I would tell him, look, particularly since you are very heavily exposed in the insurance business, why don't you engage actively into more ESG responsibility? Because it may backfire to you. One day in your insurance business, you may be caught by not having an integrated policy where you pursue profitability, but also you take care of people and the planet. The 3 P's: profitability, people, and planet. 3 pieces.
You mentioned that ESG reporting is just the tail end or the part of a system to care about the climate, people, profitability. Do we need more? Do we need a global task force to fight climate change? President Biden is asking Congress to approve hundreds of billions of dollars to remake transit in the US, overhaul power grids, expand clean energy, in a plan that the White House says will fight climate change. What do you think of this kind of package?
It's not enough to hold only corporations responsible. I think we have a common responsibility, all stakeholders of global society, which means corporations, of course, have to absorb a lot of certain responsibilities in this respect, but it's also us individual consumers. And as you rightly say, it's the government. And the government has to contribute to fight climate change by creating the necessary incentives, but also disincentives. I think there are still too many governments around the world who provide subsidies for activities which actually are damaging for the climate. And I think we need the government to step in to build the necessary infrastructures. And I have seen in the program of President Biden a great emphasis on the electricity grids. If we want to use wind power or solar energy, the place where we produce the energy may be not very close to where we actually need the energy. So you need the grid as a distribution system. So what we need is an integrated approach. We cannot fight climate change by doing here a little bit, there a little bit. We need really an integrated ecosystem approach. And I think here the government has a major role to play and to provide a kind of integrated vision for the future.
Going back to the corporate world for a minute, doesn't the case of Danone and the recent ousting of its CEO show that focusing on ESG metrics can lead to a non-confidence vote of shareholders?
Yes, of course. We have the famous case now of Danone. The CEO was ousted, and criticism was he has been devoting his time and his attention much too much to the ESG dimension and not to his shareholders. But I think it's a wrong dichotomy. We shouldn't make an artificial, let's say, polarization between profitability on the one hand and people and planet on the other hand. I think the art of good management today is to create the right balance and not to be too much just keeping in mind his stakeholders, or keeping in mind his or her shareholders. And I give you a practical example. If we compare Danone with Unilever, Unilever is certainly recognized worldwide as a company which is at the forefront of ESG thinking. But at the same time, the share price of Unilever has doubled more or less in the last 10 years. The share price of Danone has quite had some difficulties to evolve, or even had a negative development in the last year. So you can serve your shareholders are also stakeholders. So you can serve your shareholders as well as your other stakeholders.
Let me ask you this. Do you think Danone made a mistake?
Yes, they didn't pay sufficiently attention to develop also the business. At the end, I mean, it's very clear, you have to create profitability. But when I talk here about the profitable business, I think of a long-term dimension and not just short-term. And so it's a balance. And good management is always a balance. So you just have today to manage an additional dimension, which means a balance to pay attention to your shareholders and at the same time to your stakeholders.
It's undoubtedly a hard balance to strike. What company stands out to you as doing especially well when it comes to tackling climate change? What are they doing right? Can you give me an example?
I would say, if you ask me companies, of course, I'm looking at the most at the hardest hit companies, hardest in terms of being confronted with a major need of transformation. And here, if I look at the oil industry, I just take as an example Total, the French oil company. Total is one of the 70 companies which the Forum brought together to commit to report on metrics which we have developed in our International Business Council under the guidance of Brian Moynihan, the CEO of Bank of America, together with the 4 audit companies. Now, Total is one of the first companies, if you look at the report 2020, where they have applied our metrics. Bank of America is another one, and 70 companies will follow. But even if we take all our goodwill, it will not be enough. What we need is innovation. In order to decarbonize the world or to make it carbon neutral by 2050, a lot of new technological progress has to be achieved. Our present technology does not suffice. So I see here a great opportunity. We can move into an age of green innovations, and those innovations will also provide an impetus into economic growth. So many people have a tendency to see our fight against climate change as a cost and as something which is negative. Yes, it may be to a certain extent, but it's also a great opportunity. And it fits into a general development which I see in the world. I think we move away, and if I look at the young generations, the World Economic Forum has a community of young leaders, 10,000. If I talk to them, they have a different mindset. They have a different picture of the world. It's not only the material dimension, income or GDP and so on. It's well-being. And climate change is interconnected with pollution. It's interconnected with a lot of health issues. So if we want to invest into our well-being, then we have to invest into fighting climate change.
You mentioned innovation. Who's a leader that's really paving the way in terms of climate change? And what can we learn from this person?
There are many leaders in their own fields. If you take a company, a Danish company or Scandinavian company like Vestas, who transformed itself into an energy company mainly based on renewable energies, wind power, solar power, and so on. But, and here I come back to the ESGs, it's not enough to have a good intention. You have to a measurement system which shows that you make good steps towards the final objective, which is carbon neutral. So if you explain you want to be carbon neutral in, let's say, in 2030, you have to reduce your carbon emission already next year by 10% if you want to be credible. Many good examples, and what we need, and what the World Economic Forum, by the way, is providing are platforms to exchange best practices. We all talk now very much about this notion of machine learning. We need what I would call institutional learning, where we exchange good practices as much as possible. And we do not have a situation where some people are pioneers and the rest is very far lagging behind.
Speaking of pioneers, GM, America's largest car manufacturer, said it would go carbon neutral in its global products and operations by 2040. Apple committed to be 100% carbon neutral for its supply chain and products by 2030. Do you think these timelines are realistic, and are they fast enough?
Of course, we speak about a carbon-free world or carbon-neutral world by 2050. That's the objectives of the Paris Agreement. And most countries have subscribed to this objective. And many companies have now also issued statements that they would achieve carbon neutrality. Now we have to be aware that the situation is not the same for each company. We have, let's say, the energy companies, we have the Exxons, the Chevrons, and so on, who will have much more challenges to reach this objective of carbon neutrality in 2050 compared to Google, or even compared to a car manufacturer, which understands already the technology. But again, I come back, setting objectives is not enough. Being measured in the execution is important. And here's the ESGs come in again.
Do you think the energy sector, companies like Chevron, Exxon, are fully bought into the stakeholder capitalism model? Have they bought in enough to fighting climate change?
I would answer it in the following way. If they haven't bought in yet into the stakeholder concept, they are on the wrong side of history. I'm deeply convinced that we are now really at an inflection point where society as a whole does not anymore tolerate companies which are damaging nature or which are not upholding diversity and social justice and so on. I think we have a completely new social consciousness. And we have now also a world where every, let's say, deficiency can be reported very fast and can create a negative reaction. So if I were the Exxon and so on companies who are really challenged, we should not forget those companies need a complete transformation of their business models. I would commit to stakeholder concept, but would also try to create understanding in the public that for me, being in the energy sector, it may be much more difficult compared to a company which is already providing products which do not necessarily damage the environment. Mm-hmm. So it's a communications effort.
Mm-hmm. Looking forward, besides watching ESG proxy votes and corporate pledges, what else are you excited about when it comes to tackling climate change? Because as you said, you don't see it as only a negative or a burden. You see it as a possibility for innovation. What are you excited about?
I'm very excited because, as I just mentioned, we have a new mindset. We have a new social consciousness. Greta and Thunberg and other people got very aware that something is wrong here in our lifestyles, and we will have to suffer down the road, or our children will have to suffer, or we are directly affected. So we are now in a situation where climate change, or the attention given to climate change, provides us also with a higher sensitivity for other deficiencies which we have. I mentioned already a lack of inclusion, a system which is not necessarily fair in providing everybody with the necessary opportunities. And I think the pandemic has contributed to this new alertness, to this new sensitivity. It's a wake-up call to adapt and to make sure that we have all, at the end, better lives. That's what we are fighting for.
It's true, we're absolutely at a turning point. I want to thank my guest, Professor Klaus Schwab, for joining us today. He shared valuable insight on the ESG movement and how it can advance the fight against climate change, how important accountability is to stakeholder capitalism, and what companies are doing well in the push to becoming more green. I encourage everyone to check out Klaus's new book, Stakeholder Capitalism, and to follow Insider's Better Capitalism section. Thanks so much for your time, Klaus.
Thank you, Margaret.